Okay, so after a long time, I know it's been a while since I've had a deck profile, but I finally got one for you all today. And today I'm going to show you Monarchs. I know there's a more recent build of this deck, and it uses cards from Lightning Overdrive, but I'm going to try to stick to the traditional domain build. Just, it's going to have a few different things or cards in general that you could say. But it's going to have pretty much the same strategy, but it's going to have a few differences. So, without any further ado, let's get into it. So, I used 3 copies of Aether the Heavenly Monarch. So, you all know what this card does. It basically allows you to summon out another Monarch, and it can summon itself out during your opponent's main phase. You just have to pitch 2 Monarch spell or traps to the grave. And so, yeah, it's a really good card, and 3 is probably the standard ratio. But now we move on to Erebus the Underworld Monarch. So, what he basically allows you to do is you can send 2 different Monarch spells or traps from your hand or deck to the graveyard, and if you do, you can shuffle 1 card from your opponent's hand, graveyard, or their side of the field into their deck. So, and additionally, if he's in the grave, you can basically discard 1 spell or trap card, 1 Monarch spell or trap card, and then target 1 monster in your graveyard with 2400 or more attack and 1000 defense and add it to your hand. So, although he's good, I do keep him at 2 copies because I think 3 is a bit excessive, and I think this deck does benefit from more spot removal, which is why I keep it at 2 copies, so that I can use Caius the Mega Monarch. And this deck greatly benefits from Caius because he's really efficient at banishing stuff, or just removing stuff from the field, and he could potentially banish multiple copies of the same dark monster. So, I mean, I'm sure you're all familiar with what Caius does, and if you tribute a dark monster for his summon, you can make 2 targets. So he can potentially get a lot off the field, especially if you combo him with Dark Ruler no more. So that's the reason why I have the Erebus at 2 copies and then the 1 Caius. So the next card is the Stalos, and I greatly overlooked the Stalos because I initially thought he could do just everything that the regular Thestalos could do, and that's great and all. He deals out burn damage for the monster that you force your opponent to discard from his hand, but the main point is you want to look at your opponent's hand, and this is what he allows you to do, because if you can see what's in your opponent's hand, you know their strategy pretty much that they have at that time, and that's really the information you're going for here. And what's better is he's even stronger than the regular Thestalos. So that's why I use him. And just like the Stalos, I use 1 copy of Karaz. You can use more if you want, but he basically allows you to destroy stuff on the field. You mainly want to destroy your own cards, primarily set Monarch spells or traps that you have, so you can draw more cards and potentially get those cards into the grave, and so you can ultimately use their effects. So that's why 1 Karaz. So now we move on to the Squires, and I use 3 Edia the Heavenly Squire. So Edia is really good because you can normal or special summon her, just like Karaz. Karaz gets his effect regardless of how you summon him. It's if you normal summon him or special summon him. And so the same thing kind of goes with Edia, but she basically allows you to summon out other vassals like Eidos, the Underworld Squire. So you guys pretty much know what he does. These 2 vassals pretty much go hand in hand with each other. So if you summon out Edia, you can basically summon out Eidos. And they both allow you an extra tribute summon. But you have to remember, those tribute summons that these cards allow, they don't stack. So you have to use them pretty much in the moment. Otherwise you waste your tributes. So they don't stack on top of each other. So if you summon Edia and then you summon Eidos, you're not going to get 2 extra tributes. You're just going to have to make do with 1, pretty much. So that's kind of, I guess, the downside of the vassals. But for the last vassal, and also Eidos, you can banish him from the grave and basically summon him back out onto the field. So that's what's great about Eidos. But the other one, Mithra, the Thunder Vassal, this one's really good, and the reason why I don't use more is because you only really need 1, but basically this is an extra summon. If if you have her in your hand, you can immediately special summon her out. The only downside is that your opponent gets a token, but that's not a huge, I guess, downside for this deck, because you'll find out a lot later on that you pretty much sacrifice a lot of what your opponent's monsters are on the field. So basically, you sacrifice a lot of your opponent's monsters so you can use them for your plays, pretty much. So Mithra giving one token to your opponent isn't that bad. So now that we're off the typical Monarch cards, I used 2 Majesty's Fiend. And the reason why I used 2 is because I originally was using Monarchs Erupt, 2 copies of Monarchs Erupt. But there are so many conditions that you have to do in order to use Monarchs Erupt. So I just said, might as well just put another copy of Majesty's Fiend. So Majesty's Fiend allows you to basically stop a lot of monster effects from happening, or basically all monster effects. So it's a good way to shut down your opponent. And if you really want to put your opponent on lockdown, you use Majesty's Fiend, and you also use Vanity's Fiend. So Vanity's Fiend, he's notorious for basically stopping special summons. That includes you, unfortunately, but the idea is you want to go for Vanity's Fiend on your first turn, and that's why I keep the extra copy side deck. So there's a 3rd copy of Vanity's Fiend in this deck. So that's the reason why I use 2 copies. If you want to go for a bigger, I guess, more lockdown strategy, you put the 3rd copy in. But otherwise, if you want to, I don't know, have a more balanced match or go for a different strategy, then this is the ratio I would personally feel comfortable with. Or really whichever ratio you want. But this is the one I found some success with. And that's the reason why I use the ratio I do. So now for the spells. I use 3 Monarch Stormforth. This is the reason why I say it's not a big deal that you give your opponent a token with Mithra, because you can use Stormforth to tribute that token and use it for a summon of like a basic Monarch. Or if you have your own monster on your side of the field, you can also use this and use one of your opponent's monsters to summon a bigger Monarch. So that's the plus with this. And moving right along, we use 3 Pantheism of the Monarchs. So, one thing I forgot to mention is that Monarch Stormforth, it's a quick play, so you can use it on your opponent's turn. So that's the plus. So you can even set it, and then you can interrupt your opponent with Stormforth. But Pantheism of the Monarchs, it's basically the Pot of Greed for this deck, and you just have to send 1 Monarch spell or trap from your hand in order to draw 2 cards. And even when this card is in your grave, you can banish it, and then you can choose 3 Monarch spells or traps from your deck, and you basically ask your opponent which one that they want to add to your hand. So it's a great way for searching out cards. You can search out a lot of different Monarch spells or traps, particularly Domain, which is this type of build that we're focusing on. And so that's why you use 3. So you really want to draw 2 copies of, well, not 2 copies, you really want to draw 2 cards, and so that's why you use 3 copies of it. So you want to draw as many times as you can. And the first effect isn't a hard once per turn, so you can do that over and over again. So that's why you want 3 copies. And so 3 Tenacity, it allows you to search. You just have to reveal 1 basic Monarch or 1 Mega Monarch from your hand, or really just a monster with 2400 attack, 1000 defense, or 2800 attack and 1000 defense. So Monarchs basically. And this also works better with Majesty's Fiend instead of Vanity's Fiend, because Vanity's Fiend doesn't quite have the same stats as the Monarchs, although it's very similar. So that's why I wanted the 2nd copy of Majesty's Fiend, in case if I get that in my hand, I can use Tenacity more often. So we're still not quite done with the spells and traps, at least for Monarchs, but now we get to the main card. 3 Domain of the True Monarchs. This is used to lock your opponent out from the extra deck, and this is the main field spell that you want to be going for. And most of you who played Monarchs know that this is the traditional ratio you go for, and this is the reason why you play the deck, and the reason why you don't have an extra deck of your own. And it gives your Monarchs a stat boost, and it's great overall, so that's why. But I guess my own spin on this is I use 1 copy of Mausoleum of the Emperor. So because you use so many tribute monsters, so many monarchs, you'll find yourself that you need to summon cards. And at some points that maybe you may feel like that's scarce, like you don't have enough monsters to summon onto the field. So that's why you use Mausoleum of the Emperor. If you really just need to get a monarch out onto the field, or you just need to get something like Majesty's or Vanity's Fiend out onto the field, you can quickly lock your opponent out by using Mausoleum of the Emperor. And keep in mind, if you summon a monarch this way, it doesn't get its effect because it's counted as a normal, or I guess like set summon. So it's not counted as a tribute summon, and you have to pay 1,000 life points per tribute cost. So that's the one downside of this card, but this is really just to get monsters on board and for you to potentially further your strategy, though not as much as you could with typical tribute summon. But this kind of, I guess, solves the issue of not having as many monsters that you need in order to tribute summon. So that's why. And so for this particular build, I use Celestial Observatory. So you may be wondering why, since we don't use that many level 6 monsters. So this basically allows you to place 1 level 6 monster from your hand or face up on the field to the bottom of your deck, then you draw 2 cards. So you may be wondering, we have such a low level 6 monster count, but Domain, it has another effect that allows you to reduce your monarch's level, and basically Mega Monarchs are level 8. So it basically reduces it by 2, and so you get level 6s on the field or in your hand. So that's why you want to get Domain out, and then that's why we use Celestial Observatory. So it allows you to draw 2 cards anytime you do this. Anytime you send a level 6 monster from your field or from your hand to the bottom of the deck. And it's an extra added draw power. So that's why I like this card. And it also allows you to, I guess, solve the brick problem, because you're going to have a bunch of monsters or monarch monsters in your hand that you don't quite know what to do with, and you can't really do much. And this is kind of like the remedy for it. So that's why. So the monarch spells and traps, yeah, we're not fully done with them, but Return of the Monarchs, this used to be a staple 3 of, but now you only really need 2, because there's so many better monarch spells or trap cards. But basically this allows you to search out a lot of your other monarchs when you conduct a tribute summon. So you can either add a regular monarch, or you can add like a mega monarch to your hand. So this is just great to make pluses off of your tributes, and it's a continuous spell. So that's primarily the main purpose of it. And so 3 kind of just bricks in your hand, and you want to limit the amount of bricks because you're already using a lot of cards that clog up your hand. So that's why only 2. Alright, so this other card, Reasoning, this works surprisingly well. And I've had a lot of success with this card, and you may be wondering why Reasoning, because you may be thinking your opponent may be able to see your strategy. They say, oh, you're running monarchs, so a lot of them are going to be either level 8 or level 6. But you're also running vassals, and their levels are kind of different. They're level 2 and then they're level 1 vassals. And also, you can potentially summon out your, well, you can't really summon out your fiends, but you can, the main purpose why I have this card in the deck is because you basically, well, you don't really mill monsters to your grave, but it allows you to mill cards to your grave until you hit a monster that you can summon. So you get a bunch of spells or traps into your grave, or just cards in general, and that basically means you can throw monarch spells or traps like Pantheism, and then you can activate their engrave effect. So you can activate their engrave effect, and this card basically allows you to set up for that. And best case scenario is you get a monster out yourself, and then you have a grave loaded full of like monarch spells or traps, and that basically furthers your strategy. And so that's why 1 copy of Reasoning. We also use 1 for 1 to get Edia out onto the field. So sometimes you may have a hard time just finding Edia or getting her onto the field. So 1 for 1 to get her out real quick so you can get your combo going. And if you're having exceptional trouble getting her out, Reinforcements of the Army. She is a warrior monster, so You can perfectly search her out with this card. So that's why reinforcements of the army. And then Foolish Burial, so you can send something like Eidos to the grave or Erebus to the grave and activate both of their graveyard effects. So whichever one you choose to send to the grave, it's pretty much great, and it allows you to further your strategy. And so these are the cards that you want to send to your grave, apart from Pantheism. Prime Monarch. So basically, Prime Monarch, you can target 2 spells or traps in your graveyard. You can shuffle them back into your deck. That's if you set it. But you can also banish one other Monarch spell or trap, and you summon this out onto the field. And it's basically kind of like another body. So yeah, it's a great card in itself. And it's almost like an inverted Monarch, because like the stats are like backwards. But it allows for you to have another body on the field, and it's great. I mean, you can recycle cards with it, and this is like almost like a Pot of Avarice, if you can think of it that way. But it's great for recycling, it's great for giving you another body, and if it's in the graveyard, it's not really a negative. That's where it actually does best, and that's where you can use it to further your strategy. And so for the last trap, we have the Monarchs Erupt. So this is why I use Vanity's Fiend, because Monarchs Erupt is pretty hard to get off, because you have to have no cards in your extra deck, and you also have to have a face-up tribute monster. And so that's a lot of hurdles to jump through, which is why I opted for another copy of Majesty's Fiend, because this is a bit hard to pull off. And I know it's a skill drain and it can be useful, but Majesty's Fiend is ultimately better. But the reason why I wanted to use 2 copies of this is for Pantheism, in case we need to ditch a Monarch spell or trap to the grave, and we see more Monarch spells or traps in a more often kind of manner. So that's why I was kind of torn putting this at 1, but ultimately I think this is the ratio that could work. I mean, you could decide to not use any copies of this, which is understandable, but that's why I use 1 copy. Now for the extra deck. So for the extra deck, we have the 1 copy of Vanity's Fiend. You have Ash Blossom for negates, and then we have Nibiru, because you're probably going to be facing against a deck that spams out a bunch of monsters, and you need to do some crowd control if you plan to win the match, so that's why. Further, for the negates, I use 3 Solemn Judgments. You just want to say no to everything that your opponent basically does, and this is just more negates, and so you can control your opponent's board. So this is basically an anti-meta deck in essence. But one card that I don't see many people talk about is Cursed Seal of the Forbidden Spell. So I feel like this is a very underrated card, because you can discard 1 spell from your hand to negate the activation of effect of a spell card and destroy it. Your opponent cannot activate spell cards of the same name, including that spell card that was destroyed by this card's effect, during the rest of the duel. So basically, you wall off your opponent from using that particular spell that you negated. So think of all the important 3-of spell cards that they use. So Lightning Storm, that's one really staple spell card. If you hit Lightning Storm with this, they can't use that anymore. And just think of any other important 3-copy spell card that they use. That's all gone if you manage to hit it with this card. So it's a very valuable card, and I think it's worthwhile using because it can really make your opponent kind of be stuck, and they can't really do as much as they normally could. So Cursed Seal of the Forbidden Spell at 3 for the side deck. And it's a counter trap, just like Solemn Judgment. So as a speed spell 3, and a lot of the time your opponent can't respond to that kind of trap, so they're kind of forced to be negated. And then I use 3 Twin Twisters. So very obvious, it's for destruction. 3 copies of it. If your opponent's back row is giving you problems, then you slide in 3 Twin Twisters, and you can control your opponent's board that way. And I use the 1 copy of Terraforming. Sometimes you want to use Celestial Observatory for extra draw power, but sometimes you're going to want to need to, I guess, search out your field spell cards. And this is where Terraforming comes in. because we don't just use Domain, we also use Mausoleum of the Emperor. So if you have a hand that's just not working for you, and you just don't have your regular monsters to normal summon out or special summon out, then you use Terraforming, you go get Mausoleum of the Emperor, and you basically you start your combos that way. So one copy of Terraforming just to have more searchability for your field spells. And so now we move on to Shared Ride and Dark Ruler No More. Your opponent's gonna use a lot of search abilities, and so you might as well make them question whether they should use that search ability. And so it basically allows you to draw one card every time your opponent searches, and so that's a good deterrent to stop your opponent and kind of basically put your control strategy into effect. And if your opponent really gives you a hard time with their particular board, if they have a bunch of negates, you basically drop Dark Ruler No More, so you can regain control of the field and ultimately put your strategy into effect. So that's why one copy of Dark Ruler No More. I mean, obviously you can choose to run more copies of this, run it as you see fit. This is just what I found more useful, and this is what works for me, but obviously everyone's strategy is different, so that's why one copy. And yeah, that pretty much wraps it up for this deck profile. That's pretty much the meat of it and what I was planning to show off to you all. And I hope you enjoyed this deck profile, because I really do like Monarchs, and they've kind of been my favorite deck for a long time, ever since they came out. And I was really bummed when this card or this deck really kind of wasn't viable anymore, so I'm glad that we have new support for Monarchs, even though they weren't in this deck. But I decided to show a more budget build in case if you have $30 you can go get the structured decks and make a very closely similar deck to this one. And my whole purpose of this deck is to showcase the potential strategies you can do from a basic structure deck build and kind of build your own budget deck, so you kind of get into the competitive scene. Although this isn't too competitive, it does allow you to play more, aggressively than the typical rogue deck that you come across. So that's why I wanted to showcase this deck. So with that pretty much wraps it up for this video, and that pretty much wraps it up for this deck profile. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Alright, take care.
If you would like to support more content like this in the future, you can do so at my Necromancer 1040 Patreon link down below. I normally post it in the description, and you can check it there along with the other cool things I normally post down below. And with that, thank you so much for watching, thank you so much for your support, and I'll catch you in the next one. Alright, take care.